We now continue with description of our research on morality and narratives.
Stories come in many versions. Hence, if one wants to look at the effects that a story has on readers and listeners, one needs to study the many versions they produce out of it. And that's exactly what we did. We asked people to retell stories, to produce those very versions that we think are implicit in each kind of report of one sequence of events. We played telephone games. This is how we play the telephone games. We show people on a screen a short story and ask them to retell it in their own words. So the screen disappears and they write down the story, how they remembered it. In the study that I want to show you now in the following, we basically always had the same starting story that included two people, always two females, one perpetrator who commits some small crime or who does something morally bad, and a second person who observes the first person and who could intervene. But we never know whether or not the second person intervenes. It ends with an open situation at the very moment where that person has to decide whether or not she will intervene. We give these stories in three versions to different participants. One version is third person. Susan and Jessica are in the food court. Then we have one version that is told line by line in the same language from the standpoint of first person perpetrator. I, Susan, am doing this and this. Or from the perspective of the observer, I, Jessica, am in this and this place, I'm doing this. Word by word, the same thing. And what we look at now is how the stories change according to what we fed people, whether it was a third person story or first person perpetrator, first person observer. I will show you one of our starting stories. This is a story that we're using here, and it is a story of an apple thief. It is two female students who are at a food court at the university, and one of them pockets an apple and doesn't intend to pay for it. The other one is at the cash register and observes this. Now there are 5 excusing factors built into the story. I mean, the reasons why the stealing may be not as bad, and they are highlighted in green on the screen here. So, for example, the apple stealer had a bad apple the day before. Then the apples are overpriced, while the unhealthy food like French fries or things like that are subsidized, and so on and so on. Nevertheless, there are also 2 counter excuses. The first one is simply that we point out that this is of course illegal, it is stealing, and the second one is that there's a subsidized program for students or struggling students involved in it. So on a very basic level then, in the iterations, and we only look at the first retelling, but many hundreds of those, we count up how faithful people record those excuses and the counter excuses, and that, we believe, gives us some fair estimate of how people are evaluating the situation. So if they are heavy on the excuse side, obviously they seem to be more likely to find that this acceptable behavior, or at least something that shouldn't be punished in this given situation. While some stories that repeat the counter excuses more explicitly, and they do, we see that as a sign that people are more shifting the balance more toward that direction. Of course, we did some pre-testing here of the different versions. We fed the 3 different versions with third person or first person to people and asked them then to evaluate how bad this action was, or how important it was that it would be punished, and so on and so on. And we found that the differences were very small between the 3 different versions. Now, after one retelling, the whole situation looks already quite different. And this is really only after the first retelling. At this point, the numbers of excuses that pop up in each of the different story conditions already changes quite significantly. Interestingly, the very one that was just measured in the pre-testing to be slightly worse, slightly more bad, inner badness, that perspective now also features more excuses after one retelling. Of course, once we started the retellings, interesting things would happen. First of all, people drop a lot of the detail from version to version. So instead of 5 excuses, typically you would find more something like 2 or 3 of those kind of excuses that were given. But people would also invent additional excuses. Some people went out of the way to invent other reasons why it was really okay to pocket this little trivial apple, while others were very harsh on condemning this action in the emphasis. They would repeat the word stealing up to 3 times. They would make up other reasons why it was not okay to do it, or they would even build in commentary, such as, I, Susan, am obviously a spoiled B-word, and so on and so on, and continue telling what was happening here. Now, on the results, and I will comment on that here in a second, on the 3 different forms here, we see on these charts here, I want to explain that first, we see the distribution of pairs of counter-excuses and excuses. Each of the squares that you see on these charts indicates by their darkness how many story iterations had that combinations of counter-excuses, that's the x-axis, and excuses, which is the y-axis. So if it's very dark, it means, for example, in the very first story here with the third person, the 0-0 version, where you had 0 counter-excuses and 0 excuses, where you basically had a story told just the basics. Someone is stealing, a young lady is stealing an apple in a food court, and this other person is observing this. That would be a minimal story that would have 0 excuses and 0 counter excuses. That gets a lot of readings here. While in some of the other versions, you see that the darker spots tend to be slightly at different places here. What I want to point first is that when you look at the third person, there's a very clear push towards the low left corner, the 0-0 point. While when you have the first person perpetrator, which is the middle chart here, you see a much more bizarre distribution of story versions here. And I will comment that now on the next slide. On this slide, I have highlighted now what I think we see here. In the third person story, the whole emphasis is on a rather small limited set of counter excuses and excuses. Yes, the balance, that is the overall ratio, the black line, is fairly close to how it started out as 1 to 2.5, basically to 2 excuses, counter excuses to 5 excuses. That ratio seems to be similar. However, we lost detail. These are very minimal stories, with a lot of them down to the 0-0 level. Third story is not very good in maintaining detail. First person perpetrator. Who would have thought this? Yes, I think a lot of people of us would have guessed that indeed, when you're forced to kind of retell the story in this first person, or at least started out with that version, there are a lot of people who are emphasizing the excuses. There's more and more excuses. However, there's also pushback. There are some people who do exactly the opposite here. That's the 2 red lines here. The variation is very strong, where some people also condemn that perspective a lot. And then the third one that's here on the very right of the chart, we see the first person of the observer, which is actually the optimal maintained story. We have the most detail, much more than third person, and still we are actually also the closest to the original ratio here, close to the 2.5 ratio, 1 to 1 counter excuse per 2.5 excuses here. In summary, third person, while looking good at the first glance, is actually not the best way of kind of retelling the story. It lacks detail. It seems to be close to the original balance, but in fact, the other factor that I omitted here so far is the one of whether the outcome is changed. And it turns out to be that 25% of the retellers, that's a lot, change it to from an open end to saying, oh, nothing, no intervention took place. They actually decide that this is over, no one will intervene here, which I read as a preferred outcome. To say, well, let it go, let it happen. Ultimately, it's a trivial affair. This is a way of telling the story that's detached. It seems almost like no one wants to make a moral judgment here. No one wants to intervene. This is the first person of the perpetrator. I, Susan, am stealing an apple. And here what we see is that, yes, It is a very forgiving perspective. A lot of people invent further excuses, criticize the excuses. We see that on the red line to the left. Very many excuses for very few counter excuses. However, there's also a not so small fraction, basically 1 out of 3 people, who seems to be going the other direction, who is much more condemning than any of the other perspectives. So this is a perspective that radicalizes that. And the focus seems to be on the inner badness of the person. This is the one where suddenly the inner character of Susan gets judged. Again, remember the I am the spoiled B word. And the surprise winner in the contest of maintaining the original story in the most accurate form is, maybe surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, the first person observer position. The person who is in this observer and potential intervener position keeps the balance in the best way and also keeps the most detailed. It does, of course, make sense because the role of that person is ultimately to make judgment. This is the person who could intervene, who could call out what just happened here in some form. So obviously, to make that judgment requires being well informed. So this is the best form that we found. It is probably too early, based on this very simple test so far and these results, to jump to large conclusions. However, if I were to jump to conclusions here, the obvious one is that that we need to be careful when we look at accounts, when we look at narratives, how much they shape what people will make out of them already when they retell them. I mean, how they will already shift the balance just based on the perspective that was given to them. People may not even actually maintain the first person. They may still use this word Susan or so, but nevertheless, they may have shifted it along the ways that I've said here. So the interesting lesson here is that the most faithful narration seems to be the one of the first person observer. However, if you're in the business of manipulations, you may want to test out one of the other versions.
Please proceed now to part 5 of the talk.